More than 4,000 people are having dinner aboard a luxury cruise ship. Wine is being poured. Waiters move between tables. Music is playing. And then, the floor begins to tilt. Glasses slide across tables. Chairs move. People grab onto walls and railings. At first, most of them don't understand what has happened. But within minutes, water is flooding into the ship. The lights are failing. And a vessel carrying thousands of people is beginning to lose control. Before the night is over, 32 people will be dead, and the captain of the ship will be on shore. This is the story of the Costa Concordia, and how a luxury cruise became one of the most controversial maritime disasters of the modern era. If you enjoy real stories where one decision can change everything, subscribe to Molodix. Now, let's go back to the beginning, a calm winter night off the coast of Tuscany. On the evening of January 13, 2012, the Costa Concordia was sailing from Civitavecchia near Rome at the beginning of a 7-day Mediterranean cruise. More than 4,000 people were aboard. Passengers had come from dozens of countries. Families were settling into their cabins. Couples were having dinner. Children were exploring the ship. For most of them, this was supposed to be the beginning of a holiday. The Costa Concordia was enormous. Nearly 300 meters long, it carried restaurants, theaters, swimming pools, casinos, and hundreds of cabins. It was designed to feel less like a ship and more like a floating city. At the bridge was Captain Francesco Schettino. He had years of experience at sea and was responsible for the vessel, its crew, and everyone aboard. There was nothing about the evening that suggested what was coming, until the ship changed course. As the Concordia approached the island of Giglio, it began sailing much closer to shore than its normal route. The maneuver was known as an incino, a close pass near the coastline, often used as a salute to people on shore. The Concordia had performed similar maneuvers before, but this time the ship was approaching a dangerous area. Near the eastern coast of Giglio were the Skoll Rocks, a known hazard close to shore. At around 9:45 p.m., the bridge crew began preparing for the final maneuver. Orders were given to change the ship's course. The ship turned. But the maneuver was not executed perfectly. The official investigation found a series of problems during the final approach, including errors in the steering commands and their execution. For a few seconds, there was still a possibility of avoiding the rocks. Then that possibility disappeared. The ship's port side struck the reef, and everything changed. The collision did not immediately look like the beginning of a disaster. For many passengers, it felt like a violent shudder, a scraping sound, a sudden movement beneath the floor. Plates rattled. People looked around. Some continued eating. Others began asking what had happened. But beneath them, the ship had been badly damaged. Water began entering through the damaged hull. The flooding affected vital machinery and electrical systems. The Concordia began losing power. The lights went out. The engines stopped. The ship that had been moving through the Mediterranean only minutes earlier was now drifting in darkness. Emergency lighting came on in parts of the ship. The music stopped. Passengers began moving through corridors, trying to understand what was happening. And then they noticed something even more frightening. The ship was leaning, at first only slightly. A glass would move across a table, a door would swing open. Then the angle became impossible to ignore. Furniture began sliding. Passengers struggled to walk. Some returned to their cabins to find family members. Others began moving toward the muster stations. But the information coming from the ship was not clear. Passengers were initially told they were dealing with a technical problem. The reality was much worse. The ship had suffered a major breach. Water was spreading through the lower sections, and the list was becoming more severe. Outside, the lights of Giglio were visible. The island looked close, but thousands of people were still trapped aboard a massive ship that was rapidly becoming harder to navigate. The emergency response had already begun, but for the people inside the ship, the real nightmare was only beginning. The general emergency announcement came at approximately 10:33 p.m. By then, nearly 50 minutes had passed since the collision. The ship was already listing badly. Passengers were confused. Some had not yet understood that they were facing a life-threatening emergency. Then around 10:55 p.m., the abandoned ship phase began. Passengers were directed toward the lifeboats. But the ship's increasing angle created another problem. The lifeboats were designed to launch from the sides of a level vessel. The Concordia was no longer level. On the higher side of the ship, some boats became extremely difficult to launch. On the lower side, others could still be deployed. People crowded toward the available boats. Some waited, some panicked, some searched for relatives, and some chose another way out. They jumped. Passengers climbed over railings and entered the cold water. Others used ropes and whatever they could hold on to descend toward the sea. Inside the ship, corridors had become steep slopes. Stairways were difficult to climb. Objects were sliding across floors. And in some areas, the darkness made navigation even harder. Outside, the rescue operation was expanding. The Italian Coast Guard coordinated the response. Firefighters, police, rescue crews, local boats, and helicopters were involved. And on Giglio itself, local residents opened their homes and helped the people coming ashore. The island suddenly became a shelter for thousands of people who had expected to spend the night aboard a cruise ship. Instead, they were standing on land, many of them without shoes, coats, or even knowing where their families were. Rescue crews also began searching the wreck. The position of the ship made the operation extremely difficult. The vessel was unstable. The weather and darkness complicated the search. And there were still people who had not been accounted for. The emergency continued through the night and into the following days. Search teams repeatedly entered the wreck looking for survivors and victims. Eventually, the death toll reached 32. 32 people who had boarded the ship expecting a holiday never returned home. And one of the most important questions was beginning to emerge. How had a modern cruise ship carrying thousands of people ended up in this position? But there was another question, one that would become almost inseparable from the story of the disaster. Where was the captain? Because while passengers were still fighting to escape, Francesco Schettino was no longer aboard his ship. Captain Francesco Schettino had been on the bridge when the Concordia struck the rocks. In the minutes that followed, he remained involved in the response, but later that night, Schettino ended up on shore. Exactly how he got there became one of the most controversial questions in the entire case. Schettino later claimed that he had been thrown from the bridge area when the ship suddenly moved and had ended up near a lifeboat. Prosecutors rejected his account, and the courts ultimately convicted him of abandoning the ship while passengers and crew were still aboard. By around 11:40 p.m., Schettino was on Giglio. Meanwhile, authorities in Livorno were trying to understand the situation. The Coast Guard needed information. How many people were aboard? How serious was the damage? How many passengers had been evacuated? And most importantly, where was the captain? Then came the phone call. Coast Guard officer Gregorio De Falco spoke directly to Schettino. The conversation would become one of the most famous recordings of the disaster. De Falco ordered Schettino to return to the ship. He wanted him back aboard the Concordia to take responsibility for the evacuation and account for the people still inside. Schettino argued that the ship was listing heavily. He said it was dark. He said he was coordinating the rescue from shore. De Falco was furious. At one point, he ordered Schettino to return to the ship in words that would become famous around the world. Vada a bordo, cazzo. Roughly, get back on board, damn it. The sentence became a symbol of the entire disaster. One man demanding that the captain return to his ship. The other already on shore. Schettino never returned to the Concordia. His defense maintained that the situation was more complicated than the public image suggested. But the courts ultimately found him guilty of multiple offenses, including manslaughter, causing the shipwreck, and abandoning ship. And that meant the story was no longer only about what happened on the water. It had become a question of responsibility. Who had made the decisions that brought the ship toward the rocks? Who delayed the evacuation? And who was responsible when thousands of people were suddenly fighting for their lives? Those questions would take years to answer. After the disaster, Italian authorities began reconstructing the final minutes before the collision. Investigators examined the ship's route, the decisions made on the bridge, the maneuver near Giglio, the damage caused by the rocks, the response after the collision, and the evacuation. One of the central questions was simple. Why was the Concordia sailing so close to the island? The investigation focused heavily on the decision to perform the close approach and on the navigation of the ship during the final minutes. Investigators also examined the actions of the bridge team. The final maneuver involved a sequence of steering commands that were not executed perfectly. By the time the ship's course was corrected, there was no longer enough room to avoid the reef. But the investigation did not end with the collision. The response afterward became another major issue. Why did the emergency response develop so slowly? Why was the abandoned ship order delayed? And why did the evacuation become so chaotic? Schettino's defense argued that the disaster had multiple causes. They pointed to organizational failures, equipment problems, and the actions of other crew members. Other crew members were also investigated and prosecuted separately. But Schettino became the central figure in the case. His trial began in 2013 in Grosseto. For months, prosecutors and defense lawyers presented evidence about what had happened that night. The prosecution argued that Schettino's navigation decisions had caused the collision and that his actions afterward had contributed to the deadly consequences. The defense argued that he was not solely responsible. In February 2015, Schettino was convicted. He was sentenced to 16 years and 1 month in prison. The sentence included convictions related to the deaths, the shipwreck, and abandoning the ship. Schettino appealed. The conviction was upheld by an appeals court. Then in May 2017, Italy's highest court confirmed the conviction. The appeals process was over. Schettino surrendered to authorities and began serving his sentence. The legal case had finally reached its conclusion. but the physical remains of the disaster were still sitting off Giglio. The Costa Concordia was still there, a massive ship lying on its side near the island, and removing it would become a story of its own. For more than 2 years, the Costa Concordia remained off the coast of Giglio. It was no longer a cruise ship. It was a 114,000-ton wreck resting on the seabed. And it presented another danger. The ship still contained fuel and other materials that could threaten the surrounding marine environment. Removing the fuel became one of the first priorities. More than 2,000 cubic meters of hydrocarbons were eventually removed from the wreck. But even after the fuel was gone, the biggest problem remained. How do you move a ship this size? The solution was one of the most ambitious salvage operations ever attempted. Engineers decided to use a technique known as parbuckling. The plan was enormous. Underwater platforms were constructed beside the wreck. Massive steel containers known as sponsons were attached to the ship. Then, in September 2013, the operation began. At 9 o'clock in the morning on September 16th, the Concordia slowly began to rotate. Cables pulled. Hydraulic systems applied enormous force. The ship moved inch by inch. For almost 19 hours, engineers watched the wreck. Then, after rotating approximately 65 degrees, the Costa Concordia was upright again. It had been lying on its side for more than a year. Now it was standing on a specially constructed underwater platform, but it still could not be moved. More sponsons were installed. The wreck had to be stabilized. Then came the next phase, refloating. In July 2014, engineers began pumping water from the sponsons. The ship slowly began to rise. It emerged approximately 17 meters. And on July 23rd, the Costa Concordia finally left Giglio. 2 ocean-going tugs pulled the wreck away from the island. After 4 days at sea, it reached the port of Genoa on July 27, 2014. There, the ship was prepared for dismantling. The Costa Concordia that had once carried thousands of passengers would never sail again. The salvage operation had involved more than 500 technicians and 30 vessels, working around the clock for more than 2 years. And by 2017, the dismantling of the ship had been completed. The wreck was gone, but the questions remained. It's tempting to reduce the Costa Concordia disaster to a single image. A massive cruise ship lying on its side, a captain standing on shore, a Coast Guard officer shouting into a telephone. But the real story is more complicated. It was a chain of decisions, a close approach to an island, a dangerous maneuver, a collision, a delay in the emergency response, a chaotic evacuation, and thousands of passengers suddenly forced to survive a disaster that should never have happened. 32 people never made it home, and their lives should never be reduced to a headline or a famous phone call. The Costa Concordia was eventually removed. The investigation ended. The captain was convicted. The wreck was dismantled. But one question still remains at the center of the story. How could a modern cruise ship carrying more than 4,000 people end up on the rocks in the first place? What do you think was the biggest failure that night? Tell us in the comments, and if you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Molodix for more real mysteries, disasters, and stories where the evidence doesn't always give us an easy answer. Stay curious, stay unsettled,